Učinak zvan placebo znan je odavno. Toliko je neosporiv da ga se koristi za testiranje učinkovitosti lijekova, ali pravo je pitanje što nam otkriva placebo, taj toliko poznati, a ipak nedovoljno shvaćeni pojam. Nije riječ samo o tome da se čovjek osjeća bolje, već nakon uzimanja lažnog lijeka dolazi do pravih promjena na tijelu. Tako placebo postoji pokazatelj činjenice u kojoj mjeri naša unutarnja uvjerenja utječu i oblikuju fizičku stvarnost našeg tijela. A to nas dovodi do sljedećeg pitanja kojeg je postavio i američki autor Joe Dispenza i odgovorio na njega u naslovu svoje knjige Placebo, to ste vi. Ako je placebo toliko učinkovitiji od mnogih lijekova, zašto se njega ne bi koristilo za iscijeljivanje? Jedan od načina da se to dogodi jest razumijevanje procesa u našem tijelu i umu i kako kroz sustav neurona, neuropeptida, proteina, staničnih membrana i izražaja gena placebo zapravo radi. Tako i samo razumijevanje mehanizma placeba može stvoriti učinak placeba. Takav pristup placebu još uvijek će se naći samo ovdje, na rubu znanosti. Gospodine Dispenza, dobar dan.
Thank you.
Kako ste se počeli baviti ovom temom placeba? Kao i obično neki događaj s privatnog života često puta ljude usmjere u područja u kojim poslije obilježe život.
I think for some of us, in order for us to wake up, we need a wake-up call. And I was a 23-year-old person, and I was in a triathlon in Palm Springs, California. I was on the biking portion of the race, and I was coming up to a turn. And as I was making this turn, there were two cyclists on the corner. There was a police officer on the corner, and he was pointing to me, and he was waving me on to pass these two bikers. And as I passed the two cyclists, he had his back to the oncoming traffic. So when I made the turn, a four-wheel drive vehicle going very fast hit me from behind. And I catapulted out of my bike and landed on my back. And it was an 83-year-old woman driving the car, and she didn't know that she hit me, so she dragged me down the road a little ways and then stopped on her brakes, and then I rolled down the street. And I wound up breaking 6 vertebrae in my spine. And when you land really hard on your back, the compression of that force takes the columns of the vertebrae and it begins to break them. And so when you press volume down, that volume has to go somewhere. And the way I landed, it pushed it back against my spinal cord. And the top vertebrae, the 8th thoracic vertebrae, there's an arch that the spinal cord passes through, had broken like a pretzel. So I had multiple compression fractures of my thoracic spine. I had bone fragments on my spinal cord, and the neural arch of the 8th thoracic vertebrae was compressing the spinal cord as well. So they brought me to the hospital. I had 2 opinions from 2 of the leading surgeons in the hospital, and they were emphatic that the only solution for me was a type of surgery called the Harrington Rod Surgery, where they cut off the back parts of your vertebrae, and in my case it would be from the base of my neck to the base of my spine, and then they screw in these long stainless steel rods, and when they screw the rods in, it cantilevers the spinal column off the cord. And then they take bone fragments from your hip and then they paste it over the top and they hope for the best. So they told me that I probably never would walk again. I had a severe amount of pain and some neurological deficits. So then I left that hospital in an ambulance and went back to my home all the way to San Diego, California. I got 2 more opinions from 2 other surgeons, and they told me that the surgery was the only solution. And now in 1986, at that time, not a lot of people went against the conventional medical model. But I decided against the surgery. And I just thought maybe it was possible that I could heal myself. So, you know, when you're laying face down and you're not going anywhere and you're not doing anything, you're left with your own thoughts. I mean, that's what I was left with. So I believe that there's an intelligence within us that gives us life, that keeps our heart beating and digesting our food and organizing trillions of functions every single second in our body. and that innate intelligence is a consciousness, and consciousness is awareness, and awareness is paying attention. So I reasoned as a 23-year-old kid, well, that intelligence must be paying attention to me and observing me. So maybe I can turn inward and make a connection with it and give it a plan, give it a design, give it a template, give it some very simple model. And when I'm complete with that model, I can't heal myself, but it can heal me. I'll surrender that model to a greater mind and allow it to begin to work with me. Give it some instructions. And the second thing I said is I'm not going to let any thought slip by my awareness that I don't want to experience. Now that sounds really easy from an intellectual, philosophical standpoint, but when you're facing crisis or trauma, I think what happens is we tend to focus on what we don't want to have happen instead of what we do want to have happen. So for 6.5 weeks, I was in a dark night of the soul. I couldn't get my mind to do what I wanted it to do. I'd start off reconstructing the vertebrae in my spine, and then the next thing I know, I'd be thinking about living in a wheelchair. And then I lost my focus, and I was giving that intelligence the wrong information. Then I'd stop, and I'd start all over again, and then I'd think, should I sell my home? Should I sell my practice? And it took a long time for me to get my mind to do what I wanted it to do. But at 6 weeks, 6.5 weeks or so, up to that point, it would take me 3 hours to go through this whole process. And I never felt like I really connected. I do remember the day, though, that I did. And it was in a very clear moment where I felt like I hit a golf ball right in the sweet spot. I hit a tennis ball just right. Something clicked. And from that point forward, my pain levels started to drop. I started noticing changes in my legs, and I started correlating what I was doing inside of me with what I produced outside of me. And from that point on, I just healed very quickly. I was back on my feet in 10.5 weeks, and I was back in my life at 12 weeks. And I just made myself a deal that if I was ever able to walk again, I'd spend the rest of my life studying the mind-body connection and mind over matter, and that's what I've been doing since 1986.
Nakon tog ste počeli raditi radionice, proučavati neuroplastiku, epigenetiku i na tim radionicama su se pojavila mjerljiva poboljšanja koja su također bila i mjerena. Što se konkretno mjerilo sa tim istraživačima, recimo 2013. u radionicama? Što se vidjelo da se događa u ljudima?
Well, I decided that this is a time in history where it's not enough to know. And this is a time in history to know how. And people are really searching for the science to be able to prove to themselves that they can do the uncommon. So when I started seeing in the workshops that we were teaching in the last 10 years around the world, all over the world, when I started seeing people with severe health conditions right during a weekend workshop have a significant change, like someone in a wheelchair with MS, standing up and walking around after some type of inward event, I knew that in that moment that we had to start measuring, because in order for that person to truly have a significant change, there would have to be very objective biological changes that were taking place. So I gathered a team of neuroscientists and researchers, and we started measuring people's brains, how their brain functions. I wanted to have people come to an event, and we could measure their brains, then they can go through 4 days of training, and at the end of 4 days, remeasure their brain again. And I wanted to know that the changes weren't just in their mind, they were in their brain. I also wanted to measure a person's mind during the process of transformation in real time, and to gain more information about how to teach transformation better the next time. So we've done probably over 8,000 brain scans over the last 5 years. We measure what's called heart rate variability. It turns out when you feel impatience and frustration and resentment, your heart beats very arrhythmically. It beats out of order. But when you feel gratitude and appreciation and love and kindness and care, there's a resonance, a coherence that takes place in the heart. And you can train people to sustain those states independent of the conditions in their external environment. And I want students or people to get really good at leading in their life with their heart. But if you're going to lead with your heart in your life, you got to make sure it's open and it's activated. So it takes practice to trade fear and anger and hostility for inspiration, joy, and gratitude. And it's a skill, and the more you practice it, the better you get at it. We've measured genetic changes in our students in 4 days. And genes are like Christmas tree lights. They turn on and off all the time. When they turn on, they upregulate, and all genes do is make proteins, and proteins are responsible for the structure and function of your body. Proteins, the expression of proteins is the expression of life. So I wanted to see then if genes turn off and downregulate, they stop making healthy proteins and the body begins to break down. So if people are healing in our events, let's see what type of genes were signaled. So we've measured 7,500 different gene regulations in a random study, and we found out that the common genes that they all had in common that they upregulated and expressed had to do with suppression of cancer cells and tumors, the growth of new neurons in response to novel experiences and learning, not just making new connections, but actually regenerating new nerves, the activation of stem cells, those cells that are transitional cells that can go to damaged areas of the body and aging tissue and repair them, the gene for oxidative stress that helps the body process antioxidants that have to do with aging and heart disease and cancer. And then we measured the gene for the structure of the cell itself, called the cytoskeleton, which gives every cell integrity and helps it rebuild. And the cool thing about that is that it all took place in 4 days. So it proves then we're not doomed by our genes or hardwired to be a certain way for the rest of our lives, that we're marvels of adaptability and change. We've measured neurotransmitters. If a person is really feeling a love for life or a joy for existence, will it be reflected in their biology? And it turns out that students that were able to do it in a short amount of time started producing the neurotransmitters like oxytocin and serotonin, which are responsible for us feeling good and feeling love. And the measurements of those neurotransmitters were in fact supernatural. They were way outside the normal level. So that person now is sustaining a feeling that isn't fear, that isn't anger, that isn't pain, it isn't sadness. They've traded that for a different emotion, and it's being reflected in their biology. We've measured cortisol levels, stress hormone levels, and a chemical called IgA, immunoglobulin A, the primary defense against bacteria and viruses in your body. It's better than any flu shot. And when cortisol levels go up, it turns out that the immune system, IgA, is suppressed. If you're reacting to everything in your outer environment all the time, and you're turning on an emergency system for some threat, you have very little energy in your inner environment for growth and repair. So I wanted to see then if we could take a group of people and measure their stress hormones and their immune system function, and then put them through 4 days of training and ask them 10 minutes a day, 3 times a day, to feel gratitude, appreciation, kindness, care, a thankfulness, and a love for life, and see if then they could strengthen their immune system just by changing their emotional state. Turns out that their cortisol levels went down about 20%, and their IgA levels went up about 50%. Now, in order for that to happen, a gene has to be regulated. Some signal has to reach the cell. And I think that if a pharmaceutical company found a drug that could strengthen someone's immune system by 50%, it would be on every television commercial. And yet our nervous system is the greatest pharmacist that we have. We've measured the energy of the room, the energy around people's bodies. We've measured the energy centers of their bodies. I think all to prove to people that they have the power within them to begin to change and to heal. And we've made scientific history over and over again.
U knjizi Placebo ste vi zapravo ste obratili pažnju na fenomen koji je postojao već i prije i naravno da je on naznačivao da umom može liječiti i utjecati na materiju. Možete li dati jedan drastični primjer placeba i noceba, zbog toga jer mnogi ljudi još uvijek smatruju da je placebo tek nekakvo stanje gdje se osjećaš bolje nego što je, a ne da ti se doista mijenja na neki način tijelo i druge stvari. Stoga bi jedan dobar primjer placeba ili nekih lažnih operacija ili također noceba gdje su ljudi doživljavali čak i smrt zbog uvjerenja da su bolesni, mogao dobro pomoći da se vidi istinska snaga placeba.
Well, over 80% of people that are in a depression study that are given a placebo, that's 4 out of 5 people, respond to the placebo as well as they do to the antidepressant. Now, that means then that if a person, when they do a brain scan on them before the study and a brain scan after the study, and there are physical changes in their brain just by taking a placebo, it means they're making their own pharmacy of antidepressants by thought alone. The people who were interviewed after the randomized study that got better from the placebo couldn't believe that they were given a sugar pill and that their depression healed. They in fact healed by thought alone. I think the greatest example of the nocebo is the story that I start out with in the book, where a man goes to the doctor, isn't feeling well, is diagnosed with cancer. The doctor tells him, we actually interviewed the doctor. He told the patient that he had a terminal cancer and that he had a very short amount of time to live. And the patient said, well, I just want to live through Christmas, and after Christmas, I really don't care. I just want to spend time with my family. And so on New Year's Day, 1 week after Christmas, he dies. When they do an autopsy on his body, he never had the cancer that could kill him. I mean, he died by thought alone. And when you think about dying by thought alone, it makes you wonder what you believe in. And so I think that that's a strong example, but you can give someone a sugar pill and tell them that it's a certain drug, and when they take the drug, they get the side effects of that drug, because some people anticipate a good outcome, consciously or subconsciously, and some people consciously or unconsciously expect a bad outcome. So when they expect that bad outcome, they begin to manufacture the very symptoms of their own belief. 50% of every person that's diagnosed with cancer that are told that they're going to get nauseous after their first chemotherapy treatment, they get nauseous on the drive over to their first chemotherapy treatment, which means they're getting nauseous in anticipation of the event. Well, if 50% of the people can get nauseous on their drive to their first chemotherapy treatment, 50% of the people watching your show can get healthy on their on their way to work. It's the same process. It's just teaching people how the mechanism works. So when I wrote Placebo, I thought something really simple. If I understood the science behind how the placebo works, and there is a science behind it, people make their own dopamine by thought alone, their own antidepressants, their own morphines, and all these placebo studies. Once people understand the principles of it, can you teach them how to do the same exact thing? In other words, instead of relying on some external substance, like a pill that has no efficacy, no drug in it, that pill represents a symbol of possibility. Can you teach a person how to, instead of put their belief in something known, put their belief in an unknown and begin to change their biology every single day so that unknown becomes a known? And it turns out it's absolutely teachable.
Možda su neki od najdramatičnijih primjera placeba operacije koje se nisu dogodile. Operacije srca, operacije koljena, nakon kojih su ljudi živjeli kao da su zapravo napravili te operacije. No, povijest placeba nije samo anegdotalna, ona ima neku svoju znanstvenu povijest koja je obično razbacana među raznim istraživačima, ali se može napraviti neki kontekst. Pa, u razdoblju od Drugog svjetskog rata i od nekih znanstvenika liječnika kao Henrya Beechera, preko istraživanja o Japanu 62. pa do najnovijih istraživanja u kojoj mjeri zapravo se na Parkinsonovoj bolesti može vidjeti kako placebo doista utječe na neurone. U kojoj mjeri su se pokazala znanstveno i eksperimentalno efekti placeba?
Well, Beecher was one of the first people in the Western world to show that people can begin to manufacture their own morphine by thought alone. And Beecher was a physician in World War II that was on the front lines, and he ran out of morphine to do his surgical procedures. So between him and a few nurses, they conjured up a way to give the soldiers an injection of saline. It was nothing more than salt. And when they made it more of a ritual, where they told them that we have the drugs, here's what's going to help you, and they gave them the suggestion that they were going to get the real substance, Beecher was able to perform all of his surgeries without any morphine, and the soldiers reported very little pain during the process. So that sounds mysterious. It sounds like it's impossible, but it's in fact the truth. Or the children in Japan that were exposed to poison ivy, that had a very high sensitivity to the leaf. They took a leaf that looked a lot like poison ivy and told them that it was the poison ivy, and it wasn't. And they rubbed the leaf on them, and they had the rash. Then they took the poison ivy and told them it was just an inert leaf and rubbed it on them, and they didn't get the rash, which means on some level they became immune to the condition by thought alone, and they began to make their own antihistamines in response to it naturally. And then, of course, the great story is the great sham surgery that was done on World War II veterans that had degenerative knee conditions, arthritic conditions in their knee. And some people got the real surgery. Some people got what's called a lavage, which is they make the incision and they use high pressure of water to clean the joint out. And then there are a group of men that just got a nick, just a cut on the knee. Of course, they made it look like it was a real surgery. They gave them the anesthesia. The doctor told them what they were going to do. And within a very short amount of time, the people that got the sham surgery, that never got the surgical procedure, who were limping, who had very limited range of motion, all of a sudden had a very significant change. And interviewing them years later, they're still playing basketball with their grandchildren. So it begs the question then, how is it then that the body can actually manufacture these its natural substances? And Benedetti is, I think, one of the leading researchers, Fabrizio Benedetti, in the placebo studies, because when researchers and physicians and doctors said it's just a placebo, Benedetti was the ones that said, well, wait a second. If there's some efficacy, if there's some outcome that's being created biologically, let's start to measure. So as an example, he took a group of people with Parkinson's disease, which is a deficiency in dopamine in the brain. And when there's not enough dopamine in the brain, the motor neurons can't communicate well with each other, and it creates involuntary tremors. Those people with Parkinson's can try as they may to control it with their conscious mind, but they can't because it's physiological. So Benedetti said, okay, we're going to do this study with Parkinson's, and we're going to give people an injection, and we're going to tell them that they're getting a very powerful substance. And he conditioned them for a little bit, but 50% of those people that got the placebo, all of their symptoms went away. Well, the initial response was it was just a placebo. But Benedetti said, wait a second. If their tremors went away, is it possible that they're making their own pharmacy of dopamine? And so he devised a study in which he said, okay, if they're making their own dopamine, then dopamine will be in receptor sites in the brain. And if we inject a radioactive dye that fits in the same receptor sites, dopamine got there first, and we won't see any radioactive dye in the brain when we image it. But if the brain isn't making its own dopamine, and we put the radioactive dye in that fits in the same receptor sites, dopamine will not be there, and the radioactive dye will, which means the brain will image and light up with a lot of radioactivity. Turns out that these people were making 200 times the amount of dopamine just by thought alone, which means it's not magic any longer, it's physiological. There are changes biologically that are taking place in the brain. There are changes epigenetically that are taking place on a cellular level. And when people begin to really wrap their mind around this, I begin to wonder how effective real medication is. Because maybe we're just conditioned into putting our faith and belief in something outside of us, and a pill is something that we associate with whatever condition we're trying to heal. And there's no studies any longer in medical science and pharmacology and research that never consider the placebo. In other words, there's triple-blind studies for every drug that's being done, which means the researchers and the subjects have no idea who's getting the real drug and who's getting the placebo, because the power of the mind in the placebo study can range from 10% up to 100%, depending on the study.
Mogli bi se sad malo pozabaviti samom unutarnjom biologijom tijela, ono što se zove od mozga do DNK. Koji se procesi zbivaju, dakle, ako počnemo sa neuronom kao bioračunalom, pa potom sa proizvodnjom proteina, pa ulaskom u stanice, komunikacijom sa DNK i povratnom spregom? Koji je kemijsko-biološki proces posrijedi dok se zbiva ono što mi kasnije prepoznajemo kao placebo?
Well, there is a concept in neuroscience that's become the latest great explanation to understand the process of change and transformation. And that concept is called neuroplasticity. And neuroplasticity says that from every new thought that we have, every new choice we make, every new behavior we demonstrate, every new experience we have, every new emotion that we embrace, there are physical changes that take place in the brain. And every time you learn something new, as an example, you make new connections in your brain. The latest research shows that if you just focus on one concept, study one concept for about an hour, you will double the number of connections in your brain. But the challenge is if you don't review that information and you don't repeat it, those circuits don't hold together. So learning is making new synaptic connections and remembering is maintaining them. So then if people are thinking the same way, they're making the same choices, they're demonstrating the same behaviors, creating the same experiences, and producing the same emotions, then we won't see many physical changes taking place in their brain. In fact, the old model that we're hardwired or that we can't grow new neurons was based on a study where a researcher was studying rodents in an unchanging environment. And of course, if it's an unchanging environment, they're not doing anything new and their biology stays the same. So then you think a thought, that thought produces a biochemical reaction in your brain. That biochemical reaction in your brain signals another part of your brain to begin to make a chemical. And that chemical is called a feeling or an emotion. If you think an insecure thought, in a matter of seconds, you're going to start feeling insecure. Now, the challenge is that the moment you start feeling insecure, the brain is always monitoring how the body's feeling. So the brain says, oh, I noticed these chemicals, he's feeling insecure, and all of a sudden, those emotions begin to influence the same kind of thoughts. So the person starts thinking more insecure thoughts, which then produces more feelings of insecurity. And I think people get in these loops of thinking and feeling and feeling and thinking. Turns out that the redundancy of that cycle conditions the body to emotionally be caught up in a certain framework of the mind. In other words, the body is the unconscious mind. It doesn't know the difference between an experience in your life that produces an emotion and the emotion that the person is creating by thought alone. So the body's believing it's living in the same past experience 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year. And it's the redundancy of that cycle that heads us towards a genetic destiny. So if feelings and emotions are the end product of past experiences, and we can remember experiences better because we can remember how they feel, the stronger the person's emotional reaction to some event in their life, the more they pay attention to the cause. And the more they pay attention to the cause, the brain takes a snapshot. And that's called a memory, a long-term memory. So people then begin to think neurologically within the circuitry of that past experience, and they tend to feel chemically within the boundaries of those emotions. And how we think and how we feel creates our state of being. So now, the person's neurocircuitry, the person's neurochemistry, the person's hormonal expression, and even their genetic expression stays the same. Now, they used to say that genes create disease. That was something that was stated in the turn of the century, but turn of the 19th century. And then all of a sudden science came along and said, we lied. Genes don't create disease. It's the environment that signals the gene that creates disease. Less than 5% of the people on the planet are born with genetic conditions. The other 95 are created by lifestyle and behaviors. Think about it. Two identical twins sharing the same exact genome. One dies at 55, the other one dies at 82. Same genome, different environmental experience. So all of a sudden now, if the environment signals the gene, And the end product of an experience in your environment is called an emotion. The next question is, can you signal the gene ahead of the environment? And the answer is absolutely yes. Our research shows then when people begin to embrace an emotion and have a clear intention, they're beginning to change their brain and body to no longer live in the past, but all of a sudden begin to live in a new future. And yes, it takes practice to be able to keep firing and wiring those thoughts, to begin to keep reviewing and rehearsing your behaviors. It takes practice to keep emotionally cultivating elevated states that finally it becomes a habit or a skill. So what does that mean? That to the average person? A person has a trauma or a shock. A person has a betrayal in their life. They lose a loved one. They get someone steals from them. Their partner leaves them. That event is a very strong experience emotionally, and they're defined by that experience. So many of those events begin to signal the wrong genes in the wrong ways, because the emotions of anger, of hostility, of hatred, of aggression, of fear, of anxiety, of pain, suffering, guilt, shame, those are all created by the hormones of stress. Now, it's a scientific fact that the long-term effects of the hormones of stress downregulate genes and begin to create disease. So every time the person thinks about the betrayal, the shock, they're producing the same chemistry in their brain and body as if the event was occurring. And they're firing and wiring the same circuits and emotionally conditioning the body into the past. So then that person then who's living by those same emotions keeps signaling the same gene. And now they're headed for some genetic destiny, and in time they develop a condition. So then the fundamental question is, what if a person begins to think differently? Firing and wiring, creating new circuitry. What if they begin to rehearse who they want to be that day? The act of rehearsing something mentally, when you're truly present, the brain doesn't know the difference between the outer experience and the inner experience, which means you begin to install the neurological hardware in your brain ahead of the event. Now your brain's no longer a record of the past. Now it's a map to the future. So now you're priming your brain to behave exactly the way you want it to behave because you're rehearsing it. And it's no different than rehearsing lines in a play. If you go to a play and you're an actor and you haven't rehearsed your lines and reviewed them in your mind, you're not going to be able to demonstrate that character. But by rehearsing that activity in your mind, rehearsing who you're going to be, that hardware ultimately becomes a software program, which means you're going to start to naturally behave that way. And yes, when our students begin to understand that when they embrace an elevated emotion, that they're signaling the gene ahead of the environment, they assign more meaning to doing it. So the act of going from their old self to the new self does something really magical. The person starts to heal by thought alone. All of a sudden, they're in a new state of being. And the disease, the condition, existed in the old person. And they're literally someone else. And it's no different than a person with a multiple personality disorder that has an allergy to nylon stockings in one personality and type 2 diabetes in another, and healthy in another personality. It's the same exact thing when a person really overcomes themselves and they begin to express a new biology, that they can say, I'm not that person any longer. That disease that I had existed in the old person. I'm literally someone else. And we have just so many examples of people who have done it.
Kada je mapiran ljudski genom i otkriveno da ima 23.688 gena, to naravno nije bilo dovoljno čak ni za funkcioniranje tijela niti mozga, s obzirom da se očekivalo da ih bude barem 140.000 koliko ima proteina koji oblikuju naše tijelo, a proteini su zapravo svi oni čudni pojmovi koje ponekad čujemo, to su sve u stvari proteini. Što se točno događa i na koji način taj gen koji zapravo više nije nositelj ukupnog sudbine života, koji je mehanički proces onaj u kome informacija na neki način slaže razne kombinacije gena? Što se tu događa unutar stanice, dakle na tom najmanjoj razini našeg života gdje se zapravo zbiva temelj placeba?
I love the question because it causes us to think about the building blocks of how this all takes place. Think of your body as a protein-producing machine. And every cell in your body except red blood cells makes proteins. And proteins are responsible for the structure of your body and the physiological function. you could say that the expression of proteins is the expression of life. Now, in order for a cell to make a protein, a gene has to be regulated. So then, muscle cells make muscle proteins called actin and myosin. Skin cells make skin proteins called collagen and elastin. Immune cells make immune proteins called antibodies or immunoglobulins. Stomach cells make stomach proteins called enzymes. So when you're expressing the proper proteins, like your enzymes, you feel healthy. When you're not expressing the proper enzymes or hormones, you feel unhealthy. So we can say then the proper expression of proteins is the proper expression of life. So now, your body is a community of 70 trillion to 120 trillion cells, depending on the reference. And those cells have a job. They have to work as a community, as a whole, to begin to produce an outcome. So then, outside of the cell, think of the outside of the cell as receiving mechanisms from information that are taking place in the body, like craters on the moon. That's exactly what receptors are. And they're receiving information. And so, let's say a person feels angry or hostile or aggressive, frustrated. The emotion that's created from their perception in the environment causes the body to adapt to that signal. So if there's a lion out there and you notice that there's a predator, all of a sudden the brain signals the body to begin to produce certain chemicals that put the body in emergency mode. And now that emergency mode is a stress mechanism, and every single stress reaction signals a very specific survival behavior. So now, that's very adaptive if you're being chased by the lion, because if you outrun the lion, then your body goes back into balance and now you can recover. But what if it's not a lion, and what if it's traffic every morning, and the person's reacting the same way as if they're being chased by a lion? Well, the signal that's making it to the cell is saying, we're in emergency, we're in survival. It's not a time to grow. It's not a time to heal. It's not a time for long-term building projects. In fact, the receptors on the cell close down. They shut off because they have to be able to adapt to that very, very strong condition in their environment. In other words, if you're being chased by a lion, are you going to use 50% of your resources, or are you going to use 100%? You're going to use 100%. Well, what was once adaptive becomes very maladaptive, because when you turn on that stress response and you can't turn it off, now your body's headed for disease because it cannot live in emergency mode for an extended period of time. All the energy is going to some threat in your external environment. There's no energy in your internal environment for growth and repair. So it turns out that the receptors on the cell close down and the cell begins to downregulate. It stops making proteins because it's not a time to grow a baby. It's not a time to digest a meal. It's not a time for you to open your heart. It's not a time for you to learn. As a matter of fact, 80% of your blood flow moves out of your executive function in your brain and moves to your hindbrain. It moves to those mechanisms to react. It's not a time to sleep, and the body moves out of balance. So now the cell is closing down. So for the short term, that's great. But for the long term, when the cell stays stuck in that position, all of a sudden the person starts headed towards a genetic destiny. They stop expressing the healthy proteins, and that's called dis-ease or imbalance. So then people, think about this, people can think about their problems, think about the conditions in their life, and turn on that same stress response just by thought alone. And what's the significance of that? I just said that those chemicals push the genetic buttons that downregulate genes to create disease. If you can turn on that stress response just by thought alone, then your thoughts could make you sick. So the next question is, if your thoughts could make you sick, is it possible then that your thoughts could make you well? And the answer is absolutely yes, given the right understanding of how to apply it. So then now, instead of the person reacting to the same conditions in their life and creating those emotions, is it possible then, with the same level of focus and passion, to begin to create an elevated emotion like gratitude or joy or freedom, and combine it with a very clear intention. If it's done properly, with a level of passion that is equal to the experience that created the betrayal or the trauma or the reaction to their environment, the stronger the signal outside of the cell, and the elevated emotion causes the cell to say, we're out of survival. We're out of that fight or flight response. We're out of that stress reaction. And now the outer environment of the cell says, oh, gratitude means things are cool. Love means it's time to relax. Joy means that it's safe out there. And all of a sudden, the cell starts opening up. And the cell goes from that neutral place or that tissue breakdown place. The cell all of a sudden, just like we do, says, oh, it's safe in this room. It's safe in the environment. And the cell receptors start opening up. And it's the signal outside of the cell that begins to create, like dropping a pebble in the water, a ripple. And there's little antennas on the outside of the cell. The antenna picks up the new signal. The protein in the receptor site begins to change. It closes off to the stress hormones. Boom. It opens up to these new elevated states. The environment now outside of the cell is friendly. The cell all of a sudden gets the signal. The signal sent to the DNA. The DNA is a library of potentials. We use 1.5% of our DNA. And all of a sudden now, that new signal, the cell sends a signal to the DNA, and RNA begins to read the DNA to match what the signal is outside the cell. All of a sudden, the RNA starts assembling amino acids and starts making a protein which is equal to the signal of the cell. And now the cell begins to produce new proteins, and that new protein could be a new hormone, a new enzyme, a new cellular structure. But the moment that person goes back to frustration and anger and hostility, the cell closes down again and the signal goes again. And this is why sometimes it takes some time for people to heal, because they have to change the way their brain is wired and how they're perceiving the world. They have to break the addiction to those strong stress hormones. I mean, when the brain and body get a rush of adrenaline, that rush of adrenaline begins to arouse the brain and body to pay attention to the outer world, because that's where the danger is. And we get habituated into that. We get stuck. We start anticipating the next stress. So then people have to work on breaking that addiction to that emotion. And we tend to use the problems and conditions in our life to reaffirm our addiction to that emotion. We need the traffic. We need the bad job. We need the poor relationship, because it makes us feel those emotions. So when people start to figure this out and they say, wow, I'm becoming addicted to the life I don't even like. Now, just like any addiction, you have to go through withdrawals, a period of time where the cells are craving that emotion, and you have to understand that there can be a process of change. So then if a person is able to disconnect from their outer environment, to sit their body down and alter their inner state, and begin to stay in the present moment, and they start regulating emotional changes. They start changing the way they're thinking. They're becoming conscious of their unconscious thoughts. They're becoming aware of their automatic behaviors. They're noticing the emotions that they've been living by every single day. The act of observing them mindfully means that you're no longer those programs. You're the consciousness observing those programs, and you're coming out of your biology. In other words, who's doing the observing of those thoughts? That's who we really are when we're not in those programs. So then, as people begin to change, they get better at regulating the outer environment of the cell, because the outer environment of the cell is still the inner environment of your body. So the person who's thinking the same thoughts that are making the same chemicals for them to feel the same way, and then they feel those same emotions, they're signaling the same genes, but those emotions drive the same thoughts and fire and wire the brain, and now the person's complete biology is in the past. So then it takes a little practice to unravel that and move from one state of mind to another. And when it's done properly, it's no different than the placebo, because all of a sudden, like magic, that change begins to change the expression of proteins. And the expression of proteins is the expression of life. And all of a sudden, people say, my pain is gone, or my thyroid hormones are back to normal, Or, my God, my tumors have shrunk, or my MS has gone away because they turned on new genes and they turned off old genes, and all of a sudden the gene for MS is downregulated and the gene for their immune system is upregulated, and wow, all of a sudden they have a new lease on life. And when they truly change, it's really hard to change back.
Jedna od vaših knjiga, osim Placebo, ste vi i ostvari svoje neograničene sposobnosti, zove se i stvori svoje ja, novo, ili u tom smislu, znači stvorite novo ja, konkretno je naslov te knjige i CD-a. Znači, problem življenja na programu za preživljavanje je možda čak i dublje, reklo bi se, metafizičke prirode, s obzirom da ste u knjizi objasnili kako čovjek u takvom stanju ima samo 3 bitne točke uporišta. Tijelo, ja, jesam li siguran, okolina, je li ona sigurna ili opasna, uglavnom izvor prijetnje, i vrijeme, znači kada će ovo proći, i zato se u takvom stanju dolazi do određenog sužavanja percepcije na sebe samog, opasnost od okoline i kada će to proći, manjak vremena. No, također se tu pojavljuje i druga strana sa opet 3 elementa. Znači, placebo učinak u mozgu u stvari ima 3 elementa. Kondicioniranje, očekivanje i značenje. Pa bilo bi dobro objasniti što oni rade nakon što smo vidjeli što ovaj život na programu za preživljavanje opasnosti radi.
70% of the time for the average person, they're living under the stress response. And that means then they're perceiving their outer world as dangerous, as threatening, that they can't control or predict an outcome in their life, or they have the perception that things are going to get worse. Now, that primitive system called the fight or flight nervous system, or the sympathetic nervous system, is what allowed us to survive in a very dangerous environment. In other words, it's healthy to feel fear when you're being chased by a tiger. In fact, if you don't feel fear, you're in trouble. It's healthy when a mother is protecting her offspring, that she's angry and aggressive, because that's what's going to protect her offspring. So these are healthy adaptive qualities in an environment that's unsafe. But when we have experiences in our life that are challenging, that create those same chemicals, it's natural for us to prepare for the next time that happens. Now, this is where it gets dangerous, because now we're always preparing for the worst. And in survival, if you prepare for the worst, anything less that happens, you have a better chance of surviving. So people get habituated. They get switched on to this.
Selfish even.
We get very selfish, because in survival, you pay attention to 3 things. Number 1, the very arousal of those chemicals puts all of your attention on your body. Like if you're being chased by a predator, you better be paying attention to your body, because it's of primary importance. The second thing is you put all of your attention on your outer world. Where am I going to run? Where am I going to go? What other challenges? We begin to narrow our focus, and our senses are heightened, and we're looking for the danger. And so then all of our attention goes to the outer environment. Now, what is our outer environment made up in our normal life? Bodies, people, objects, things, and places. So now all of a sudden, all of our attention is on our 3-dimensional reality. The third thing is time. If you're being chased by a predator, you're obsessing about how much time you have to get away from it. So the body, the environment, and time. So now, when all of our attention is on our body, all of our attention is on all the elements in our environment, and all of our attention is on time, everything in this 3-dimensional reality is made of a matter. All of a sudden, we are enslaved to the conditions of Newtonian physics. Things take time, that we need our senses to define reality. And so the more a person is addicted to those hormones, the more they believe they're their body. The more their body is actually controlling them. The more that they put all of their attention on their boss, their coworkers, their cell phone, their computers, their texts. And the more there's just always attention on time. So then the stronger the emotion that you have to someone or something, the more altered you feel inside of you, the more you pay attention to your ex, to your boss, to whatever it is. And where you place your attention is where you place your energy. And all of a sudden now, people start giving their power away to everything in their outer environment. Now this is where you could say it's like having several leaks in a boat. You have no energy for healing. You have no energy for growth and repair. You have no energy for long-term building projects. So how do we change that? It would make sense then, in order for a person to truly begin to heal, they would have to get beyond their body. They would have to get beyond their attention to people and objects and things and places. And they would have to get beyond anticipating the predictable future based on the past and settle into the present moment. And so that's exactly the model we use to teach people how to do this. We teach them then that when they become nobody, no one, no thing, no where, and no time, that is the moment they're no longer enslaved to their identity that's connected to the three-dimensional world. And if you're not your body, you're not the people in your life that you relate to, the things you own, the objects you own, or the place you need to go, or even time itself, there's only one thing left that you are, and that is a consciousness or an awareness. That's the moment you're a thought. And if you're going to heal your body by thought alone, if you're going to create some outcome in your life by thought alone, then you got to become thought alone. And we have measured this many, many times. So then we take a person and we say, okay, the placebo is built on three things. First thing is called conditioning. I give you a blue pill and you have a headache and there's a analgesic in that pill. You take that pill, you notice your pain goes away, you think what you did to make that pain go away, and you associate that blue pill with the pain going away. I give you the same blue pill the next day, you have a little bit of pain, you take that pill, your pain goes away. You remember you took the pill. Now your conditioning process starts. I give you another blue pill with the analgesic in there, you take it again, your pain goes away. Now you're creating an associative memory. All of a sudden I give you a blue pill that has no drug in it, you take that blue pill and your pain goes away. That's conditioning. You start conditioning that object with an outcome. So the second thing is anticipation. Because now, when I give you that blue pill, you begin to expect that very outcome. And so you begin to make the very pharmacy in your brain and body just an anticipation of the outcome. So now you have conditioning, which is based on the past, and you have expectation or anticipation, which is based on the future. But if most people who are caught in a rut that are anticipating their future based on their past, many of them will think on some level their disease will never go away because it hasn't gone away up until that point. But what if you give them something new? You say, we got a new drug, we got a new pill. Or we teach them, instead of putting their faith and belief in a known, something outside of them, they put their faith and belief in an unknown, and they begin to marry a clear intention, a vision of the future, with some new elevated emotion. Well, they're doing the exact same thing. If I give you a placebo, and I say, this is the drug that's going to make your disease go away, and that pill then is a symbol of possibility. It represents a potential in the quantum field, a new outcome. And your brain naturally starts thinking about getting better, and it's different. You start expecting something new. And then you start feeling optimistic, inspired, enthusiastic, and theos, filled with God, joyful. Now you're combining a clear intention with an elevated emotion, and you're doing exactly the same thing as if I said, don't use the pill. Just start focusing your mind on that outcome and begin to emotionally embrace how it would feel if it actually started to occur. Now, instead of doing it with something outside of you, you're doing it inside of you. And when you combine a thought and a feeling, thoughts are the language of the brain and feelings are the language of the body. And how you think and how you feel creates your state of being. Now that person is in a new state of being. So if they can practice moving into a new state of being every single day, their biology begins to change. The third thing that makes the placebo so effective is when the doctor walks in and puts a chart up and says, this drug allows the serotonin to stay in the receptor sites, it blocks the enzymes, and they show the pictures of the synaptic cleft and the patient's looking, and they tell the whole story, and now the patient is starting to assign meaning to what they're taking. And sometimes that's not even the truth. It's just a story or a model that someone made up. So then when you combine conditioning, expectation, and assigning meaning to something, that's how the placebo works. Now, in our workshops, in the research that we do, That's exactly what we do. We teach people how to condition their body to a new mind. We teach them, instead of expecting the same outcome every single day, instead of putting their faith and belief in some exogenous substance outside of them, we have them put their faith and belief in a new possibility without anything outside of them, and begin to marry it with that expectation of joy and inspiration and enthusiasm. And they're now expecting a different outcome than the same outcome, and they're changing their state of being. And every single time we teach them, I want our students to know what they're doing and why. And when you understand the what and the why, the how gets a lot easier. So we will talk about neurocircuitry, neurohormones, neurochemistry, gene expression, because the more they understand what they're doing and why, the more they can assign meaning to an outcome. And when you assign meaning to an outcome, you put your intention behind it. So then nothing's left to conjecture, nothing's left to superstition, nothing's left to dogma. They know exactly what they're doing. And it turns out, when they have those three elements in place, it works better than the placebo. We have seen people with cancer, lupus, MS, chronic pain syndromes, anxiety, depression, rare genetic disorders that medical science has no solution for, skin rashes that are aggressive eczemas and psoriasis, thyroid and hormonal imbalances, brain tumors, just go away. And I have to say, as a researcher, there are many times where I'm more surprised than anybody, because I never thought that we would reach this point where we would see such dramatic changes if you just take it a little further. And so it's a very exciting time.
Kada se gleda iz perspektive kemijske unutrašnjosti tijela, jasno je da čovjek zapravo može promjenom kemije mijenjati svoje izražaje, kada se zna kako funkcioniraju geni. No pravo je pitanje u kojoj mjeri, s obzirom da suvremene discipline kao kvantna biologija i drugdje, u kojoj mjeri se takav utjecaj i proces i povezanost nastavlja kroz neke mehanizme koje možda još ne poznajemo, a koji nadilaze ono što mi smatramo granicama svoga tijela. Odnosno, što su to možda naši stari, kao što je jedan Václav Havel rekao, možda danas znamo više o stvarima, ali su naši preci možda znali nešto bitnije.
Well, I think that science is actually trying to catch up with what we innately have been doing for thousands of years in order to heal. And that I think that we should never wait for science to give us permission to do the uncommon. I think we should go out and do the uncommon and do it repeatedly, and then have science come and change their laws to begin to explain how that process takes place. And so what a great time in history, because we're trying to catch up with something that is we are innately wired to do. And people heal by thought alone all the time. They just put their faith and belief in something outside of them. But our ancestors always knew that the healing always took place within them.
Gospodine Dispenza, hvala vam puno i do neke sljedeće prilike. Doviđenja.
Hvala. Thank you.